Hello and welcome to another Artis Opus tutorial. Today we are tackling a heavily requested historical kind of suggestion from the viewers, which is orc skin. We're not doing it one way though, we are doing it three ways. Now we're doing it three ways pretty much with the same paints and same products, but I'm spending 5 minutes on one, 15 minutes on another, and then 50 on a final one. Do stick around for that final one because I am actually copying a 2011 masterclass book from EAVY Metal. This is an amazing book. It's really, really incredible. Unfortunately though, when you're copying something done by Mr. Latham, who is a painting genius, or painting Jesus, it's a little bit unforgiving. So we'll see how that one goes. Was really pleased with the result of all three of them actually, and as ever, I think the real strength is in combining, the fast methods, the slow methods, contrast, washes, layering, all of it, packing it into one and trying to get the absolute most out of the minimum possible time. Anyway, let's jump in and see how it goes. First step might surprise a few people. We're actually going to go in with some Magos Purple. It's diluted a tiny bit with Aluminium Medium, probably a little bit less than 50-50. And what I'm going to be doing is just taking a lot of it off the brush. It's not too strong anyway, this one. And this is going to be concentrated in the recesses of the model. It doesn't matter too much if you get it in other areas, it'll pull in the recesses, and with it diluted, you shouldn't have too much to worry about. So, it might seem a bit tricky, but honestly, with the somewhat glossy finish spray, and the fact that we've not got too much on the brush, you can pretty much just push it at where you think you would like it, and it will go to the right place. So, I'm concentrating this on the recesses. Anywhere where there is a dip in the model, it is getting hit with this. So the next step is probably one that you're expecting. I don't need to tell anyone who's used this, but you can already tell by looking at the difference between these two on my palette. Let me just bring that up to the camera. Even mixed with Aluminium Medium, and for once I'm going to use the back of my brush instead of the fluffy end. This is a strong contrast paint. Even diluted, it looks pretty potent there, as you can see on the palette. Big difference between the two. This is about 50-50, this is about 50-50, and this one just looks way more scary. That is with good reason. So what I'm going to do is dump in a little bit more of Aluminium Medium, get it to a state that I'm happy with. And obviously I prime my model on the palette, so I can tell exactly what's going to happen here just by testing it here. That's about okay. And then we're going to hit this all over. Now, I will be making sure that, number one, I don't have too much on the brush. And number two, just in case anything was done drastically wrong, I am ready to fix this. It might take 2 coats thinned, but I would rather that than 1 coat thick. Okay, so what I'm going to do is grab a blob. It's such a scary looking paint, it really is. So that's probably about 1/4 medium now. Now I'm going to test this somewhere because how this looks on the palette seems to have been different from how it's behaved on the model. You always got to be ready to adapt depending on how it looks. That's much better. That is about perfect. Okay, cool. So with this, I can proceed without, need for too much caution, but I'm not going to be laying it on mega thick. Time for highlights. So we've got a little bit of Warpstone Glow here. It's a really nice color. Not too over the top. And I'm going to mix a fair bit of my contrast medium in with it. This will darken it slightly, but it will help tie it in with what we've got elsewhere on the model. Just getting rid of excess here, and it also lets me test it, nice and close to the piece itself. This is going to go on the lower parts of the model, or the face. Underside bits basically. Then what I'll do is wash out my brush completely and go to some undiluted. This should be a little bit brighter. And I'm going to use that on the raised areas. Just a quick way to make the brighter or upwards facing parts of the model a little bit lighter. And essentially what I'm doing here is anywhere where the contrast medium didn't pull, that is an area that I'm concentrating on. And then quickly, no mucking about, I'm going to go to a much brighter colour. Now you can use any colour that is of this kind of spectrum, you know, yellowy greens. I'll use Moot, but you could absolutely use something bright, and that bright yellow green from Monument is outstanding. 50-50 it. With our Warpstone Glow. Again, testing here. Just the same concept as when I dry brush. I just don't want any nasty surprises, and as we are trying to work fast here, we're not fanning around on the palette as much as we would be normally. Finishing touches, some ivory here from below. You could use any of, you know, this type of color. I picked one that I know covers fairly nicely. And then what's especially easy, you can still do this when it's on the model, but I always work myself from the base to the tips of teeth. And then any kind of mistakes that I have, they end up working into a form where at least you're brighter at the end of the tooth and you're lighter at the bottom, which feels kind of realistic anyway. I've jumped to a smaller brush, and the way I approach eyes is, generally speaking, with kind of like wiping motions until I contact the eye from the side, and it just makes sure that I'm less likely to have a slip up. There we go, so basic orc flesh ticked. So here we've got it's 2 thin coats of Warpstone Glow, just to base coat the area. I did that over black and it covered surprisingly well actually. So what I'm going to be doing here is I am actually going to try and use pretty much, not that one, that's the exact opposite. I'm going to try and use pretty much the same colours on this one as I did on the last one, but we're just going to be doing it in a more timely fashion. This is a softer contrast, definitely. Feels a bit more like a wash to me. I'm going to put a blob of medium in there. Again, this is Lamian medium. And this time, because we've already got the green on there, I'm going to be coating the entire thing in this. I'm working fast because I don't want any areas to be partially dry when I go back and touch them again, but I am going to be soaking up the excess. That's really important. You could go with something a little bit lighter, so that's why I had the flesh tearers out. You can mix in a little bit of that with it. One of the wonderful things about orc flesh is it could be pretty much any colour you want. As long as it looks fantasy-like, you're pretty good. And even if you painted it like normal flesh, whether it's dark or light, that would still be quite different and therefore quite fantasy-like. So here we go. Base coat on, doesn't look too perfect or anything, but I've just not let it pull in the recesses overly, and there isn't any smudges. One thing to be mindful of when using wet washes or wet stages like this is you should keep it the same orientation if possible, because if you ended up tipping it one way and the other, that actually is going to confuse the drying process. With that stage dry, we've got a little bit of nuance in the details. Maybe I should have gone a little bit lighter with that, so you know, if you want something a bit lighter, the thing that I would recommend mixing in is something a bit more pinky basically, but this is still going to look super solid. The nice thing is there that we don't have to worry about, you know, staining if we'd used black or a really dark green or something. It's fairly subtle. So I've got Warpstone Glow here on my brush, and just like the last one, what we're going to do is essentially areas where it hasn't pulled, we're going to put down a quick, this is pretty much a base coat again, but you're just doing it in selected areas, so somewhere between layering and highlighting, I'd say. Always think that one of the most difficult areas of orcs is the big flat bit on top of their head, but luckily this guy's got a ponytail. Now for areas, my mix is quite thinned for areas around the face. Ironically, rather than, I think a lot of people think that you should get more and more delicate as you get close to the eyes and stuff like that in terms of dilution and things, but I'm working in a smaller area and I want it to cover, so I'm going to be very careful with where I'm putting my paint. But my paint is less diluted than it was for those large flat areas. Wherever I touch, I want one coat coverage here. So it is still dilute a bit, but I'm helping myself out in terms of making sure when it touches something, I don't have to touch it again. And I'll use the same kind of consistency for this bottom lip here. Okay, so that's taken several minutes of what we've got remaining. Let's rock on with the other steps. So again, I've mixed Moot Green in with our Warpstone Glow, about 50-50. And just like with dry brushing, I tend to start on the areas that I know are safe. So there's definitely going to be a light bit on the top of his ear, So why not start there and see, you know, if I've mixed in too much of the lighter color. This does look quite light in comparison, but I think it's just about okay. We'll just have to be careful that we don't go too thick with it. You know, if you think you're just about there, but maybe you went a little bit too bright, what you can always do is just grab a bit more water, dilute your mix further, take a bit more off the brush, and then you'll be doing exactly what you want. Because it's a glaze, it just won't seem quite so opaque, so quite so extreme. Okay then, so that green skin is looking pretty tasty actually. I'm going to go for one more highlight, and actually what I'm going to do is add in a tiny bit of bone. You could add in a bit of yellow here, completely up to you. But I'm going for a lighter rather than brighter in terms of colour. Again with a bit of water in there. And what this should do is this should give us something that is really going to stand out quite easily. Alright then, and then what I'm going to do is quite carefully make sure that I've got some nice wet paint on the end of my brush, but not too much of it, and I'm going to get out and catch the undersides of his eyes. You can always darken these down if you don't want it, but it's very easy to not touch up these areas. You do want to be bringing attention to everything around his eyes, his face. Okay, so pretty punchy final highlights. Maybe they've obscured the previous work a little bit too much, but very effective in terms of bringing attention to his face. So I'm going to quickly whisk around now, touch up his teeth and stuff like that, and he should look pretty tasty. So these teeth, I'm going to introduce a bit of Rhinox hide. Now Rhinox has got really great coverage, so this should not take long. Just basically blocking in the entire area, and the reason for this is that I don't want black cartoony gaps in this. There's nothing wrong with how they look, but as we're going for a slightly higher paint job quality, it makes sense for it not to be a difference between black and white, but to be a difference between, you know, like an off black color. So a deep brown here is going to be really useful. Okay, so you're going to take some ivory, a tiny bit of the Rhinox hide, this should give us a great base coat. This is probably the last stage where we have to be super delicate. We are running out of time, but it does make sense to have this bit done very neatly. Next step is tiny bit of Fire Dragon Bright. I'm going to mix it a little bit with the red. And I'm going to try and dot here. Now, fluff-wise is up to you whether you want your orcs' eyes to have pupils or slits or whatever. I just prefer to have little, like, evil glowing gems. There we go. Okay, so hopefully we can see the difference between these two. From the side profile, more depth to the other one. The teeth have got more difference between them. It's not just white and black. And we'll see what we can do in 50 minutes on the other one. We have one more head left, and we're going to be doing something very different for this. This is the EAVY Metal Masterclass book. It was published in 2011, and basically was a Bible back then. I believe when this came out, shades, which were called washes, in their first iteration had just been released. And this is the EAVY Metal team just showing us how incredible they are, or were, even back then, you know, a decade ago. So what I'm talking about in particular here is the Ork Warbust tutorial. Where better place to get some reference for some orc skin done by Darren Latham. Just look at that. Look, he was annoyingly talented for decades. I'm going to be trying to copy and follow this method. Now this is a bit more old school. There is nowhere to hide with stuff like this. It's just controlled layering. I do not have as much brush control as Darren Latham does. Obviously, I'm not as skilled as him, and I've got 50 minutes, so I might have to skip a few of these steps, but let's see what I can do going from a really old school method from a dark base and working all the way up, just getting brighter and lighter and more compact with my highlights. So yeah, let's give it a bash. Off we go now. I don't have access to the paints that existed years ago, obviously because they're not made anymore. So what I've done is I've just base coated with Castellan Green, just 2 thin coats as normal. Got pretty nice coverage. It is a base paint, so looking very nice. And the stage listed in that guide is it's a black wash with black paint mix. So in that it was Chaos Black and Badab Black. I'm going to go for Abaddon Black and Nuln Oil, which sounds like it's a bit extreme, but we've got to remember that Abaddon Black doesn't have incredibly good coverage. I am going to water it down though, as we have been previously. Let's just test how it's looking there. Now, I don't want anything too extreme left from this, so I wouldn't be surprised if I only use 1 brush full and then I take it all over the model. Make sure that every section is hit. There's no tidal marks. I am trying to achieve a pretty decent level of paint in here. There you go, 1 tidal mark. Should have worked a bit quicker there. All right, stage 1 down. Okay, so I think I may be out of thin that a little bit too much, so I'm going to do a second stage. And this time I will work a little bit faster. Still trying to keep it as light as possible, as in not pulling overly at any one section of the model. Often second stage washes just come out better anyway because they're landing over themselves. All paints like to coat over exactly the same as they are. Okay, I think that's a lot more successful. Looks pretty dark at this stage. Now, because Gnarlok Green doesn't exist anymore, and I don't have all the paints margin equivalents, I'm actually going to be mixing a bit of Castellan Green with Warpstone Glow for the next stage. And this should basically just knock back the Warpstone Glow so it is a little bit more drab and not too vibrant. And essentially here, I'm going to be covering all but the most recessed areas. These stages should get faster and faster, but especially at this point, we are covering pretty much the entirety of the flesh of the model, so it's going to take a little while. That actually took quite a bit longer than I was expecting. Let's see if I can bring this up here with a more helpful background. There, so you can see I've left those little bits showing through. This is completely unforgiving. I had a couple of slips and I definitely felt the pressure of not being able to make a mistake. Not nearly so forgiving as previous methods. So what we're going to do now is just add in a much higher proportion of Warpstone Glow. That mix we've got down there is already 50-50, so this makes it pretty much majority Warpstone. And just like the previous step, we're going to be layering this in carefully and trying to avoid a small amount of the previous step, so leaving that in the recesses. Dilute a little bit more. And as ever, I'm going to start on a section that I view as, you know, pretty much safe. Okay, so that mix is about right. Again, we're just going to be covering the previous areas, leaving a small amount at their border to let the previous stages show through. I am definitely finding this more stressy than I thought I would be. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but the slips I'm finding a little bit difficult to control. So I had a couple of slips highlighting areas around his face and whatever, but it is looking pretty solid. So the next step is just to go to pure Warpstone Glow. Our last mix was a very high proportion of it, so hopefully this shouldn't stand out as being too, you know, too over the top. Seems okay. Needs to be a little bit more dilute though. Again, we're just trying to land within the previous areas, leaving a small amount of the work that we did in the last step showing through. As you do each stage, they do get faster, but you also are required to be more and more delicate and cover less and less. So it's kind of an interesting mix of speeding up, but also feeling slightly more stressy. So we're coming on okay. Definitely I'm feeling untalented as a painter at this stage. It's just a degree of control that I've not had to use for long. So the next mix is meant to be a 4 to 1 to 1 Goblin Green to a yellow that doesn't exist to a bone that doesn't exist. So what I've got here is Flash Git's yellow and Karak stone, and then we're still using the warp stone glow. So what I'm going to do is just add a little bit of the yellow and a little bit of the bone in and see where that gets us. That looks pretty good actually. It's interesting here because you're adding a yellow which makes it more vibrant, but also the bony colour is fairly toned down. Now, I don't know whether I should be glazing this or layering it or whatever, but I am going to make sure that I do not have too much on the brush, for sure. And then let's test it somewhere where we know we're going to want it to be really bright. So how about the brows? All right, so that's quite a nice color. It's not too aggressive a step up. There's several stages to go, so my temptation here is to do this, in a way that kind of looks or feels like final highlights, but there is a lot of steps remaining if I am to follow the guide. So I'm going to make a conscious effort to make sure that I don't just do really tiny lines and that I leave room for any following steps that are meant to be forthcoming. So that one has been largely successful, really starting to see a pretty large degree of depth here that you'd hope for with that many stages. So that means that I've done an acceptable job of not completely obscuring the previous stage with each subsequent stage. Now the recipe calls for a higher proportion of the bone and the yellow. And we are starting to get now into, quite bright colors in comparison to how we started off. As ever, let's test it elsewhere. See, here's quite a lot brighter than colors we've had previously. Again, let's start on the brows. As we know, whatever we do, they're going to be pretty bright. Adding that bone in really does some magic to it. Rather than just getting brighter, you're getting lighter in a really interesting fashion because you're introducing something that wasn't there at the start of the paint job. We are looking pretty good actually. That last step was actually very rewarding because it really did quite a lot for the kind of overall effect of this. This would look amazing if it was done on an entire model. Now obviously if the model's take, even if you're meant to spend more time on the face, if a model's face takes 50 minutes just for the skin, the time for the rest of the model is really going to add up as well. So you'd hope that it would look good, but it does have quite a lot of depth. I don't think the camera's hugely doing it justice either. Now the final step, quite scarily, is a really thin layer of just the bone color to the raised areas. Now that is decidedly scary for me, so I'm going to be thinning it even further than that. And I'd much rather go in, too gently than too heavy with this step. Again though, this should do wonders because you're introducing, for the first time, you've got a pure version of that different color that we've transitioned towards. Don't want it pulling anywhere, it's just a way to draw attention right to the very front or most prominent bits around the mouth and nose. Also, that's going to be a little bit of a glazy stage for pinking things up, potentially next to the teeth. Often orcs have got slightly pinky lips, and this will help that land a bit better as well. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes remaining, so let's see where we can get. I don't have to cover too much of this. Okay, so I just added his teeth in. I went through Karak stone to the ivory, just in little lines there. The glazing has done, it's done an all right job, but I feel it's actually dulled the final highlight result a little bit around his lips, which is a bit of a shame. And you can see there I've dotted the eyes in with a lighter color. Now it's time to go to them and sort them out with a little bit of a red. These are so tiny that I don't feel there is too much you can really do to make the most of them, other than have them squinting, from their recesses, looking a little bit evil. That one's gone a bit squinty. We can fix that with a wash. and the tiniest dot Fire Dragon. I've not chosen Troll Slayer because I just want something that is super bright, slightly pastel in the case of this one, and just will allow me to go in there and be delicate with. So there we go. Notably a step up from the middle one. Just a bit more subtle, basically. You can see one of the highlights here stands out as looking a bit chalky, so maybe I could have been a bit smoother in my transitions, but pleased with it. And then in comparison to the 5-minute one, especially where, you know, we are worlds apart. As ever, I think probably taking a mix of the parts of all three of these and blending them together would be the best way to achieve the, the highest level result in the minimum time possible. And we are done. So largely here, basically you're just swapping a lack of subtlety for subtlety. That's how I'd view these kind of most of all. So if we concentrate on the contrast one, it is absolutely fine, super solid, little bit of detailing on there. The teeth are really, really, really important. And going to a sharp white, I think, even though it's less subtle and kind of it brings attention to the face, it does bring attention away from the skin a little or gives it a nice counterpoint. So going to white on those teeth, I think, would be a really good idea. Now these two, these are a lot closer than I thought they would be, the 5-minute and the 15-minute. And I think that's just because layering is a more time-intensive technique. So really for me, I think probably the real strength would be to get somewhere halfway between these two. You could absolutely, try again. You could absolutely use contrast in the recesses or mix with your shades or something like that, but I think the subtlety of the final paint job mixed with the efficiency and also the depth that you get with washes. So you can see the one that's darker there is the 15-minute one, and the one that is lighter is the 15-minute one. I quite like the depth of the dark one, and you get that from using the shades. So yeah, quite happy with all of them really, given the time I've put into them. Let me know which one is the most relevant to you, or which one you think is the best, or which aspects you take from one and apply to the other to get, some awesome hybrid method. I think actually looking at all of them, if you gave me 1 minute and told me do whatever you can do to pick those up in 1 minute, I could do quite a lot, particularly with the middle and first one. Just some purple washes in the recesses or some glazing on the lips, on the eyelids like I did on the final one. You could really hike that paint job up to the next level. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please like, please comment, please subscribe. Give us those suggestions for future videos. Really, really do appreciate them. And hit that bell notification to be notified for future content. We will catch you in the next video.